Section 11 of My Musical Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. My Musical Life by Walter Damrosch. Chapter 10. The Damrosch Opera Company, 1895 to 1899, Part 2. During the New York season, my wife and I stayed at the stately old house of our dear friends Sophie and Tina Furness on Fifth Avenue and 40th Street. With characteristic kindness, they not only took a large proscenium box for every performance, but, having heard that affairs had not gone well financially, insisted that we must be their guests for the entire New York season, in order, I suppose, that I should not have to incur the extravagance of an hotel. These elderly ladies, together with a married sister, Mrs. Zimmerman, were the daughters of an old East India merchant who, in the earlier part of the 19th century, had amassed a fortune. Their house was full of lovely old furniture and mementos of a bygone age, and they dispensed within its walls a very generous and dignified hospitality. An old colored coachman named Brown had been with them for 40 years. He always, together with a young colored footman, sat high up on their carriage in great state and solemnity. The young footman having been sent away in disgrace during our stay, Brown was instructed to procure another boy to take his place. A week elapsed, and the new boy had not been found. And when Miss Sophie said to him, "Brown, why haven't you gotten us a new boy? Are they difficult to find?" he answered, "No, Miss Sophie, there's plenty o' boys, but I find it so hard to match my color." He evidently was a great stickler for unanimity, not only in the color of the livery, but of the skin as well. Miss Sophie, the oldest of these three delightful ladies, had an incredible vitality, and although bodily infirmities and advancing years did their best to curb her, she remained active, cheerful, and undaunted until the end. Almost every night during my opera season of 6 weeks she would hobble from the carriage to her proscenium box, supported by her cane on one side and the footman on the other, and she listened to the Wagnerian music dramas with unflagging attention. Not even the length of Goethe-Dämmerung or Meistersinger would faze her, and after the performance, during supper, she would proudly repeat, while her eyes fairly snapped with laughter, some remark of mine that I had made 2 years before at their country place in Lenox during my delivery of a series of explanatory recitals on the Nibelung trilogy. Another fellow guest was Dr. Sturgis Bigelow, an enthusiastic admirer of Madame Ternina's art, who had come to New York especially to be present at all of her appearances. She was to have made her farewell to America in the Goethe-Dämmerung, and Dr. Bigelow had ordered enough flowers from half a dozen of the florists of Broadway and Fifth Avenue to fill the entire Academy. But unfortunately, Madame Ternina became ill, and her place had to be taken at the last moment by her rival, Madame Klafsky. Dr. Bigelow had no desire to present the floral testimony of his adoration to this rival singer, and therefore proceeded on the difficult task of cancelling his many orders, but as many of the wreaths and lyres had already been prepared, his bill for damages was quite large. Before Ternina sailed for home, she told me that she intended to stay away for a few years. I had paid her $500 in appearance, which was a fair honorarium at that time, as she was absolutely unknown, and therefore had not yet developed a sufficient drawing power to warrant a higher fee, but she said she would not come back to America until she could command a fee of $1,000. This decision she adhered to, and when she did return a few years later, Maurice Grau cheerfully paid her the $1,000, and she was immediately proclaimed one of the greatest Isoldes of our time. My New York season opened on March 4th, 1896, with Beethoven's Fidelio. The audience was a distinguished one, containing a great many of the old Academy habitués. Grand opera had not been given there since 1888, when the tenor Italo Campanini had brought over an Italian opera company. Of Klasky I have already spoken, but my new baritone, Dmitri Popovici, also made a sensation. I had found him in Bayreuth, where he had sung Telramund and Kurvenal. I produced my own opera, The Scarlet Letter, during the second week, and the reception accorded it was more than cordial. As the Symphony Society of New York wished to present me with an exquisitely bound copy of Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter as a memento, Richard Welling, the secretary and an old friend, suggested to Anton Seidel, who was in the audience, that he be spokesman, but as he refused, Welling presented the book to me himself. While the balance sheet of the 5-month season showed a loss of $43,000, the larger part of my gains of the year before, I cannot say that my wife and I were very much cast down. Youth is optimistic, and the loss of money is, in itself, not such a dreadful calamity if one still has enough to pay one's debts, and all this time I was adding to my experience and artistic stature. After a long consultation with my wife, we both decided that the conditions under which I had worked that disastrous winter were not normal, and that we could well risk another season. 2 factors influenced me greatly in this decision. One, that a group of Philadelphia citizens had come forward and desired me to consider their Academy of Music as my artistic home, and said that they would give every possible assistance to a regular season there, and the other was that Abbey and Grau frankly confessed to me that they had made a mistake in not accepting my offer of a combination. They had not been fortunate in the choice of their German singers, and had lost $150,000 on their German operas, which was nearly 4 times as much as I had lost. Grau suggested for the following season an interchange of certain artists, and if I would occasionally lend him Madame Klofsky, whom he admired greatly, he would in turn give me Madame Kalbe for a few performances of Carmen. This arrangement seemed admirable to me, as I was beginning to feel that Wagner opera alone was not sufficient to give a well-balanced opera season, and that for a longer season Philadelphia would demand a more varied repertoire. For the following season of 1897-98, affairs moved much easier for me. The Philadelphia Committee gave me a guarantee for a regular opera season at the Philadelphia Academy of Music. This assured me a home and a permanent place for my large store of scenery, costumes, and properties. Rehearsals also were thus made easier, and for my New York season in the spring, Abbey and Grau again rented the Metropolitan Opera House to me. I had re-engaged Madame Klofsky, but to our great sorrow she died, and the problem of finding a successor was a serious one. Madame Gadsky, who had charmed our audiences with Elsa, Elizabeth, and Sieglinde, was rather young for the heavy dramatic roles, although I had begun to train her in the Walküre and Siegfried Brünnhilde's. I began negotiations with Lily Lehmann, and was successful in obtaining her wonderful services for the following year, but of this I have written in detail in another chapter. The financial results of this season were quite satisfactory, but I was beginning to chafe more and more under the unsympathetic task of manager. To rehearse singers and orchestra from morning until night was a pleasure, because there was an artistic ideal to be achieved, and because there were all manner of musical difficulties to be overcome. That was part of my work as musician and conductor, and the fatigues and worries connected with this were easily endured. But the managerial duties annoyed me, and the constant intrigues among the singers, directed sometimes against each other and at other times against the management, often seemed to me unbearable. In the spring of 1898, Madame Nellie Melba, the golden-voiced, told me that she would like to join my company for the following winter, and suggested that her manager, Mr. Charles Ellis, well known as the manager of the Boston Symphony Orchestra, form a partnership with me, the company to be called the Damrosch Ellis Opera Company, half of the repertoire to be devoted, as before, to the Wagner operas, and the other half to the performance of French-Italian operas, with herself as a principal singer. We were to pay her $1,500 a night, 10 times a month, guaranteed. The suggestion seemed to me reasonable and advantageous, and arrangements were made accordingly. This combination aroused great indignation on the part of Mr. George Haven, the president of the Metropolitan Opera House. Madame Melba had been one of the principal singers there for several years, and he felt that it was an act of ingratitude on her part to leave the Metropolitan, and on mine to take her into my company, as I had myself been associated with the Metropolitan during so many years while he was president. I did not think that his anger was justified, as a great deal of water had flowed downstream since those days, and as Melba, for reasons of her own, had definitely decided to sever all connections with the Metropolitan, I could not see why I should not make her a member of my company. But he could not or would not see my side of the controversy, and vowed that as long as he was president of the Metropolitan I should never set foot in it again in a professional capacity. This vow, however, was subsequently not adhered to, as I not only gave performances there later with my own company, but during the seasons of 1901 and 1901-02 officiated again as conductor of the Wagner operas for Maurice Grau, who had then become the sole director and lessee of the Metropolitan. The combination of Wagnerian operas with the operas of the French-Italian school, of which Melba was the glorious star, proved successful from a popular and financial standpoint, and the season showed a handsome profit for Ellis and myself, although a great part of this was dissipated by a spring tour in which Melba, supported by a small company of singers, chorus, and orchestra, toured the western cities. This tour was managed by my partner Ellis, and I did not accompany them, as my services as conductor were not needed for the French operas. I had by that time definitely decided to give up all further connection with opera as manager and devote my future life absolutely to purely musical work as a symphonic conductor and, as I hoped, also as composer. The harassing occupation of managing singers proved increasingly distasteful to me, and I felt that I was too good a musician and artist to waste my time with such things in which the only advantage could be a possible pecuniary gain. I found that many singers were like children, with no clear conception of right or wrong. Their constant life in close proximity to each other at rehearsals and performances often begets an exaggerated conception of themselves and their importance to the world. They think that as their contact with the public is only over the footlights, where they receive enthusiastic acclaim for their artistic representations, the public literally exists only for the purpose of hearing them sing, and they willingly ignore the fact that the public may have other interests, such as family, finance, politics, or religion, to claim its attention. As it is important for a manager not only to maintain a balance in his ledger, but to seek the best results that a disciplined ensemble may attain, he cannot always be in harmony with all the individual desires and demands of his artists. He must often cast his opera in opposition to their personal pride, and I have letters today from several of the greatest artists of my company, insisting that they must leave or break their contracts because I had wounded their deepest sensibilities in putting so-and-so in the role which they claimed for their very own. I found that some of them even indulged in occasional efforts at petty blackmailing. One of my tenors, who shall be nameless, had a clause in his contract that he should not be called upon to sing Tristan the day after a very long railway journey. We had played in Cleveland, giving a Lohengrin performance in which, however, the other tenor had appeared, and took a night train in comfortable sleeping cars, in one of which my tenor occupied a drawing-room, to Pittsburgh, which is, as my reader is aware, a distance of only 150 miles or so. As we left Cleveland, my friend the tenor appeared in my drawing-room, and calling attention to the clause in his contract relating to Tristan and a long railway trip, insisted that he could not sing Tristan the following day in Pittsburgh without endangering his voice. But if I would pay him $500 extra, he would take the great risk of injuring his voice and would agree to sing. Naturally, I was furious, and told him politely but firmly what I thought of him, and then sent for my other tenor and told him that his rival was trying to blackmail me, and I suggested to him that if he would sing Tristan for me in spite of his having sung Lohengrin the night before, I would consider it as a performance outside of his guarantee. Needless to say, he jumped at the opportunity of gaining an extra $600, and at the same time putting one over on his hated rival. I then went to bed and slept soundly on a pillow made downy by a deed well done. Next morning I received word from tenor number 1 that he had changed his mind, was feeling very well, and would sing, but I very haughtily told him that it was too late and that I had already made other arrangements. So far this story seems a wonderful example of virtue triumphant and vice defeated, but alas, life's problems do not always work out that way. During the day my dramatic soprano, who was to have sung Isolde, became hoarse, and the opera had to be changed, so that all my carefully reared structure of righteousness and meting out of punishment to the guilty, one fell to the ground with a very dull thud. This is only one of many such instances, some of them childish and others really wicked. But the most unmoral thing about it is that when the culprits were great artists, no matter how much they enraged me by their wickedness, after they had appeared again triumphantly as Siegfried or Isolde, I would often become so enthusiastic over their work that their slate would be washed clean, and I was ready to forgive them again and to begin anew. Such is the power of art, and a grateful public will always be willing to remember only the artistic uplift which they have received from the artist and forget his personal weaknesses. Naturally, my strictures apply only to certain of the singers. There were many who were always honorable in their relations with me. Among the most devoted of the members of my company, I should mention the singers of the chorus. Many of these had been at the Metropolitan in the German opera days. Their salaries were small, but if one of their number fell ill or suffered other misfortune, none so quick as they to help, and they always endured the hardships of travel with great good humor and unfailing courtesy and decency toward me. Among other reasons that impelled me finally to give up the opera was the realization how comparatively seldom absolute artistic perfection can be obtained at a stage performance. There are so many people concerned in it that it is almost impossible always to obtain a cast which is thoroughly satisfactory, and one second-rater can spoil an ensemble. Still another problem was the question of stage illusion. I gave this a great deal of attention and study, and spent a great deal of money on scenery and lighting. I examined the best inventions in this direction in the opera houses of Germany, and imported many of them. I was the first to bring over the very clever swimming machines used in Dresden by the Rhine maidens in Rheingold. But Wagner's demands on the stage are so extraordinary that a real illusion is not often possible. His music excites the imagination and is often all sufficient. One can see the glorious flames crackling and burning around the sleeping Brunhilde when one hears an orchestra of 100 playing the music of the fire charm. But how seldom does a stage performance enhance this illusion? The Brunhilde may be too big and too fat, or the light of the flames may too clearly show that the scenery is but painted canvas and pasteboard after all, and our sophisticated eyes know only too well how the plumber's steam pipes convey the steam that is intended to simulate the smoke of the flames from the boiler in the cellar. It sometimes seemed to me, after striving in vain to carry out Wagner's ideal of a union of all the arts in order to produce a new and perfect art form, the music drama, as if this great genius had really committed a gigantic mistake, and as if the very artistic illusion and semblance of verity was destroyed by the scenic paraphernalia. Of course there were performances over which a happy star seemed to shine, and which now and then gave us complete satisfaction and happiness. But the static quality of scenery became to me more and more a hindrance to an imagination ready to soar on the wings of the music. I carried on my opera company for another year, in conjunction with Mr. Charles Ellis, and then definitely resolved to cease all managerial activities and to confine myself absolutely to purely musical work. It took me some time to arrive at this decision, as opera work has also a very fascinating side, and I had made real friends with many of my singers. I had found Ellis to be a delightful partner. He had had years of experience as manager of the Boston Symphony Orchestra, and his equable temperament and fair-mindedness had made him many friends. I sold to him my share in all our scenery, costumes, and properties, as he wished to continue operatic work with Madame Melba as his principal star, and I agreed to conduct a limited number of Wagner performances for him in Philadelphia during the following season. After the 4 hectic years I had spent with the Damrosch Opera Company, I was glad of such an opportunity to take stock of the past and cogitate on the future. My wife and I rented the old Butler place in Westchester County near Hartsdale, a lovely old mansion surrounded by dark pine forests and with the Little Bronx River trickling through, and there we spent most of the winter until May. I wrote a violin sonata there and enjoyed the tranquility of a life freed from operatic worries and excitements. In 1900 I was once more tempted into the field of opera, but this time it carried with it no managerial or financial responsibility. Maurice Grau was at that time the lessee of the Metropolitan Opera House. Abby had died a few years before, and the directors, who had gradually realized that it was Grau who had been the real man behind the gun, gave him and a small group of financial backers the lease of the Metropolitan Opera House. Grau invited me to return to the Metropolitan as conductor for the Wagner operas. He had at that time a strong group of Wagnerian singers. At the head was the inimitable Jean de Reschke, together with his brother Edouard. Grau had also taken over from my company Madame Ternina, David Bispham, and Madame Gatsky. The latter had been a member of the Damrosch Opera Company for the entire 4 years of its existence. She was only 23 when I first engaged her, possessor of a lovely voice and an indefatigable worker. There were weeks on our Western tours when she would appear on 5 successive days as Elsa, Elizabeth, Sieglinde, and Eva. She was a hard student, and her voice developed more and more. During her last year with me, she added the Walküre and Siegfried, Brunhildes, to her repertoire, studying them with me, partly on the trains while traveling, partly in the hotels and theaters of the various cities we visited. When she went into the Grau company, she added the Götterdämmerung, Brunhilde, and Isolde, thereby completing the entire circle of Wagner soprano parts, except Kundry. Jean de Reschke, like Lily Lehmann, turned to the Wagnerian roles in the high noon of his operatic career. He had made his fame in the French-Italian operas, but Wagner attracted him irresistibly. I remember that during one of the seasons of the Damrosch Opera Company, we were playing in Boston at the Boston Theater, while the Abbey and Grau Company were performing in the huge Mechanics' Hall. Jean and Edouard de Reschke attended one of my Siegfried performances with Max Alvary in the title role. They applauded their colleague vociferously, and after the performance Jean lamented to me that he was compelled to sing nothing but Fausts and Romeos and Werthers, while it was the ambition of his life to sing Wagner. The memory of his extraordinary impersonations of these roles later on is too vivid to need comment from me. Illness kept him away from America 1 year, and when he returned I was again at the Metropolitan as conductor of the Wagner operas. It was a joy to work with this man, great artist, courteous gentleman, and generous colleague, and, what is most valuable to a conductor, indefatigable at rehearsals. His return was like the triumphant entry of a victorious monarch. He was a marvelous mimic, and used to give us delicious imitations of the various artists of the company, coming into his dressing room to offer their congratulations after his first reappearance. De Reschke would first depict the French tenor colleague, who, in polite, reserved, and even patronizing accents, would say, "Vraiment, mon cher, vous avez chanté très bien ce soir, très bien, je vous assure." Then would come the German baritone in a double-breasted frock coat and punctiliously polite manner, saying, "Erlauben Sie mir, Herr de Reschke, Ihnen meine große Hochachtung auszudrücken für den wirklich ausgezeichneten Genuss, den Sie uns heute Abend bereitet haben." He was followed by the Italian baritone, who would rush in impulsively, and, kissing Jean on both cheeks, would exclaim, "Caro mio, carissimo," followed by a flood of Italian words. Then came the real climax of the scene. Enter the electrician, who, thrusting a horny hand of toil into that of de Reschke, would exclaim in real Yankee accents, "Jean, you done fine." Edouard de Reschke, the huge bass brother, with the heart of a child and an imperturbable good nature, was an equally good mimic, but his wonderful stories and impersonations were of a decidedly Rabelaisian character, and will not bear repetition here. With these 2 well-corseted but un-Corsican brothers, Madame Ternina or Madame Nordica, Madame Schumann-Heink, and David Bispham, we gave performances of Tristan, which came as near perfection as I ever hoped to witness. Madame Nordica had been for years a so-called utility singer at the Metropolitan. She had been trained in the French-Italian repertoire, and while her voice was beautiful, she had not yet achieved full stardom, perhaps because she was American-born and lacked the European cachet, which at that time was more important than it is today. She was not by nature musically gifted, and was able to learn a role only by the hardest and most painful work of endless repetition and rehearsals. But her ambition was boundless. She bided her time and, like Lily Lehmann, gradually worked herself into the Wagner repertoire. Realizing its advertising value, she offered herself to Madame Cosima Wagner for the Lohengrin production at Bayreuth. She meekly accepted every instruction given her there during the months of preparations, no matter how meticulous or artificial some of them seemed to her, and the success which she obtained there launched her successfully on her career as a Wagner singer. I trained her in the Brünnhildes as well as Isolde, and was amazed at the way in which she achieved through hard work what nature gives to others overnight. I remember her coming to Philadelphia to sing Goethe Dämmerung with my company. She arrived the previous day, and I found her still very uncertain in the second act, which is rhythmically very difficult. I sat down with her at 8 o'clock that evening, and we went over that second act again and again until about 4 o'clock in the morning. It was ghastly but wonderful. At 10 a.m. I gave her an orchestral rehearsal, and in the evening she sang the role with perfect assurance and with hardly a mistake. One performance of Tristan, which we gave with the Grau Company in Baltimore at the Lyric Theatre, which has perhaps the best acoustics of any auditorium in the country, still stays vividly in my memory. At the close we were so elated that all concerned kissed each other ecstatically after the last curtain fell. Those are the rare moments that make one forget the many times perfection in opera seems impossible to attain. End of section 11.